Chapter 30. What is this? What are you doing here? What's burning? Aunt Harriet's foot stamped on the floorboards, and Maggie slowly rose, straining against the cramps in her knees. Nothing, she answered. Her voice was a croak. She tried to immobilize her aunt's eyes to keep them from looking around the room, but Aunt Harriet's gaze had already begun to pull away, and Maggie's eyes followed, taking in the scene as her aunt must be seeing it, a jumble of old doll furniture, a knick-knack dog, and a worn basket, Aunt Harriet's own scarf in red tatters, a pair of dolls face down on the floor, a doll's tea set, and Maggie gasped at the sight, a mass of china fragments on a small table. "Lillian," Aunt Harriet cried out, "look at this. It's the Dresden figurine. It's smashed to pieces." Maggie stared at the remains of the ballerina, its slippered feet here and there, its lace frill a scatter of crumps, its fingers a trail of chips, its face an open hole. She reached toward the table, but a hand pulled her back. "The Dresden ballerina," Aunt Lillian cried as she joined Aunt Harriet at the table. "For over 100 years," she said in a voice that Maggie could barely hear, "we have had that in the family, and in 1 minute it's gone, gone." Both aunts gazed down as though at a dead body, touching nothing, barely breathing. Maggie could slip away now. Around the wardrobe she could go, across the floor, down the stairs, through the hall, out the house. "What's this?" Aunt Harriet seized a match, another match, the blackened parasol frame. "Maggie!" And she whirled around. "Come back. What were you burning up here?" "She was about to set the house on fire," Aunt Lillian exclaimed. "If we hadn't come up when we did, she would have." "Harriet," she cried out, "look at your scarf, the Persian silk. It's torn to shreds. Take her downstairs." And in the next moment, a hand gripped each of her shoulders, and she was steered across the attic floor, down the narrow dark steps, leaving behind the 2 dolls playing dead on the attic floor. On the floor, Juniper upside down in his basket, and the ballerina, the beautiful ballerina, scattered among the cake crumbs on the table. The parlor stood empty. The guests were gone, but a semicircle of folding chairs remained in front of the window, and empty teacups and plates rested here and there like shells on a beach. The 2 aunts seated Maggie on a chair against the wall and stood over her, side by side, a pair of giant birds about to invade their dinner. They started out in very quiet voices, quiet and low. Aunt Harriet first. "How do you imagine it looked," she began, "when our guests arrived and you were nowhere to be seen? What do you think it was like to have all our guests searching the house for you, from top to bottom, behind every tree in the garden?" Aunt Lillian continued. "How do you think we felt when it came time to discuss the business of the day-to-day business of the day How do you think we felt when it came time to discuss the business of the day and the business of the day had disappeared?" And although that was one of those questions no one was supposed to answer, Aunt Lillian answered it anyways. "Like fools," she said. "We felt like fools." And now their voices began to rise. "You have betrayed us," one cried. "You have disobeyed. You have vandalized. You have committed arson. You have committed larceny." Arson, larceny, which was it? One was burning things down, and the other was what? Something about people's wives? No. Stealing? She had stolen something. The ballerina and the scarf. "You took our most valuable heirloom and destroyed it. You tore our clothing to shreds. You nearly burned down the house. After we took you in and cared for you all these months, we bought you a beautiful dress." Aunt Harriet's voice grew shriller at each word. "And then she came to dress. It shattered altogether." People sounded like that before they began to cry, and Maggie wondered if her aunt's face would suddenly spatter with tears. "We bought you a doll, a beautiful, clean doll, brand new, but you wouldn't touch it. You didn't play with dolls, and now we find you surrounded by rubbish playthings from a scrap heap. How do you know those toys hadn't belonged to some diseased child? They're not Maggie began, but she fell silent. What were Timothy, John, and Miss Christabel doing right now in the attic, she wondered. Making up their minds, probably, that it was safe to get up. Just beginning to stir, probably, slowly shaking their Sunday clothes free of wrinkles and looking around. In a moment, they would set Juniper right side up in his basket, and then they would discover the ballerina lying in splinters on the tea table. "Mercy," Miss Christabel would say, and Timothy John's hands would click together in distress. "What is that in your sleeve?" Aunt Lillian demanded. "Look at this, Harriet. She's taken someone's handkerchief." "Whose is it?" Aunt Harriet asked, and both women bent over the little square of cloth Miss Christabel had given Maggie. "It's hand-embroidered," Aunt Lillian said. "It seems very old. Look how tiny it is. It must be Vera Burton's." She always carries a handkerchief. She must have dropped it when she was searching the room upstairs. Where did you get this handkerchief, Maggie? Maggie watched as the handkerchief was stretched and turned in her aunt's hands. I found it, she said. I found it on my way to school. Stolen, Aunt Lillian declared. I'd know Vera Burton's handkerchief anywhere. I found it. Maggie's voice rose to a shout, and she began to believe her own words, to picture the tiny embroidered handkerchief crumpled against a lamppost in front of the school building. She saw herself coming upon it suddenly one morning, a surprise like a hidden burst of flowers unexpectedly blooming on the pavement. She saw herself picking it up, examining it, sniffing it, smoothing it out, rubbing it along her cheek, running her finger over the satin smooth stitching of the roses, making it hers. It's mine, she shouted. I found it. But Aunt Harriet pressed it into her own hand, making it disappear behind her thumb like a coin in a magician's palm. Maggie's eyes darted around the room, coming to rest at last on the two portraits over the mantel, the man's, the woman's. Isn't it mine? She wanted to ask, winning their support, but they only stared at her coldly. She's a common thief, Aunt Lillian said. But all of a sudden, something in the picture caught Maggie's eye, and the voices of her aunts became only a jumble at her back as she advanced to the wall. It's hers, she whispered, looking up at the woman on the canvas. It was hers. The handkerchief that protruded from the lace cuff on the canvas bore the same grouping of roses with the same latticework of dark green stems as the one now in Aunt Harriet's hand. That was where Maggie had seen the design before, on the painting. The handkerchief had belonged to the lady over the mantel. It's hers, she whispered again, and in the next moment she lunged at her aunt and scratched the little scrap of cloth out of her hand. It's hers, she shouted, crushing it into her own palm, and she ran from the room, along the hall, through the garden door, across the lawn, beyond the birches, past the roses, and into the border of woods at the far end of the garden.